This story matters because war is not only decided by bullets. It is also decided by whether soldiers still feel connected to home. In early 1945, millions of letters were stuck in warehouses across Europe. Soldiers waited for news that never came. Morale began to slip quietly but dangerously. This episode shows how one U.S. Army officer faced that crisis, not with weapons, but with discipline, structure, and leadership under pressure. Major Charity Adams was given a task most people would dismiss. Clear the backlog. Restore the system. Prove it can work. Many people think mail is secondary in war. It is not. For deployed troops, a single letter could steady a mind before a mission. It could remind someone why they were still standing in the cold. Without that connection, even strong units begin to feel distant and worn down. Adams understood this from the start. She did not treat it like paperwork. She treated it like a command problem. Millions of undelivered messages meant millions of broken connections. What her battalion did next changed that, and it offers a clear lesson about leadership when systems fail. The unit was called the 68th Central Postal Directory Battalion. Most people simply knew them as the 68. They were part of the U.S. Army's Women's Army Corps. Around 800 to 850 women served in the unit, depending on the moment and reporting strength. They were led by Major Charity Adams, who would later become Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams. They left the United States on February 3, 1945. The Atlantic crossing took about 9 days. When they arrived in Great Britain, winter had not eased. Cold air moved through buildings that were never meant for this kind of workload. Their destination was Birmingham, where warehouses were already filled with mail that had nowhere to go. What they were given was not a normal assignment. It was a system that had broken under pressure. Mail had piled up for months. Some of it had been sitting untouched for long periods. Sacks were stacked high. Labels were incomplete or wrong. Units had moved, split, or disappeared. The front line did not stay still, but the records could not keep up. Many people at the time saw this as clerical work. That is the misunderstanding. This was not routine sorting. This was a theater-wide failure in communication. Millions of letters and packages were waiting to reach soldiers who depended on them. Without that connection, morale suffered in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. Inside the warehouses, the conditions made it worse. Lighting was poor. Heating was unreliable. The work never stopped. Rows of parcels stretched across the floor, names repeated across envelopes. Some soldiers shared the same initials. Others had changed units more than once in a short time. Addresses often meant very little by the time the mail arrived. The Army itself added another layer. The 68 served in a segregated force that shaped how they were viewed and how their work was judged. They were not just expected to perform. They were expected to prove something larger about who they were and why they belonged there. Charity Adams understood that weight. She was not there as a symbol. She was there as a commander responsible for results. Her focus was not on how the mission looked, but on whether it worked. That mindset would define everything that followed. For many of the women in the battalion, this deployment was something they had fought to achieve. African American leaders and organizations had pushed for opportunities like this. They wanted Black service women to serve overseas in meaningful roles, not just remain limited at home. This mission carried that expectation with it. Inside those buildings, the reality was clear. This was not about paperwork. It was about restoring a system that connected millions of people across an act of war. Every letter was a link between a soldier and home. Every delay weakened that link. You can picture the scene. Cold air moving through broken windows. Long tables covered in envelopes. Stacks of mailbags waiting to be opened. Women in uniform working under dim lights, focused, steady, and silent. They were not reacting to chaos. They were stepping into it, preparing to organize it. And at the center of it was a simple question. Not how to sort faster, but how to make this system work again. When they stepped inside those warehouses, the scale was impossible to ignore. The backlog was often described as around 18 million letters and packages. It was not a pile. It was a system failure spread across rooms and corridors. The air was cold, light was weak, and somewhere behind every envelope was a soldier waiting. Around 7 million American service members and civilian workers depended on that mail system in the European theater. That number matters. It meant the problem was not local. It touched almost every unit, every rotation, every base that had moved faster than its records. At that moment, Adams had to decide what this mission really was. She could treat it as routine work. Sort carefully, move slowly, protect accuracy at all costs, even if it meant months of delay. That would be safe, but it would not solve the real issue. She could also triage, push through the easiest cases first. Clear, visible piles. Show progress quickly, even if the hardest cases remain stuck. Or she could do something harder. Step back and rebuild the entire workflow from the ground up. Treat the backlog not as a pile of mail, but as a broken system that needed structure. The constraints were clear and constant. Troops were moving across Europe almost daily. Names repeated across units. Some soldiers shared identical initials. Addresses were incomplete or already outdated by the time the letters arrived. The buildings themselves were not designed for this volume. Heating was unreliable. Lighting made long hours harder. There was also pressure. The expectation was that clearing the Britain backlog could take up to 6 months. The battalion was under watch. Their performance would not just be measured in numbers, but in perception. Adams chose the third option. She reframed the mission. This was not clerical work. This was operations. She divided the battalion into 3 shifts. Each shift worked 8 hours. Together, they covered the full day, 24 hours of continuous movement, 7 days a week. No idle time, no gaps where the system paused. That decision changed everything. Instead of reacting to the backlog, the unit began controlling it. Work flowed instead of piling. Every hour had purpose. Every section knew its role. The environment did not improve, but the structure did. You can picture the change. Tables assigned. Sections defined. Movement patterns set. Mailbags opened in sequence. Items passed from one stage to the next without delay. Not rushed, but steady. The immediate effect was not dramatic on the surface. There was no single moment where the piles disappeared. But something more important happened. The problem became measurable, trackable, manageable. That is the first real leadership lesson in this story. Adams did not accept how the mission was described to her. She redefined it in a way that allowed action. Others might have seen paperwork. She saw a system that needed command. And once she did that, the battalion could begin solving it. The next problem revealed itself almost immediately. Even with structure in place, the mail could not be sorted in any reliable way. Names alone did not work. Too many soldiers shared the same last name. Some had identical initials. Others had already moved 2 or 3 times in a single month. A letter might be addressed correctly when it was written, but wrong by the time it arrived. Units shifted. Hospitals filled and cleared. Replacement troops moved forward while others were pulled back. The front line changed faster than the records could follow. That meant one thing. Sorting by name was not enough. Sorting by unit alone was not enough either. Both systems would create errors. Letters would still stall. Some would never reach the right person. Adams and her battalion had to decide how to identify people in a system that no longer matched reality. They had 3 basic paths. They could rely on unit sorting. Move everything by division or regiment. That would be simple but inaccurate. When units changed, they could double down on names. Try to separate each individual by spelling, rank, or guesswork that would slow everything down and still create confusion. Or they could build something more precise, a cross-reference system that tied each person to a unique identifier, then updated it constantly as conditions changed. The constraints made that last option difficult. The scale was massive. Everything had to be done by hand. Time was limited. Mistakes would ripple through the entire system, and whatever they built had to stay consistent across a moving war. They chose the hardest option. They built an index, card by card. They created a system that tracked individuals using military serial numbers. Not just names, not just units. A number that belonged to one person only. That number became the anchor point for everything else. The size of it grew quickly. Millions of entries. More than 7 million individual cards were created and maintained. Each card represented a person somewhere in the theater. Each one had to be checked, updated, and used to redirect mail accurately. This was not fast work at first. It required discipline, consistency, attention to detail across long hours. But once the system took shape, something changed. The backlog stopped behaving like chaos. Instead of guessing where a letter might go, the battalion could look it up. Instead of holding undeliverable mail, they could redirect it. Instead of repeating errors, they could correct them. A letter addressed to a soldier who had moved could now be traced. His serial number linked him to a new location. That connection turned a dead end into a route forward. Pause the story here for a moment. This is what logistics leadership looks like in practice. Not machines, not automation. A system built by hand under pressure with real consequences. It is not abstract efficiency. It is disciplined thinking applied at scale. Imagine opening a sack filled with letters. Some are months old. Some carry news from home that may already be outdated. Some are addressed to soldiers who have been transferred, injured, or reassigned. Without a system, those letters remain stuck. With a system, they move again. The real work was not lifting the bags. It was restoring identity inside confusion, matching each name to the right person, giving each letter a path. The immediate result was quiet but powerful. The backlog began to break down into parts that could be solved. Each card added clarity. Each corrected route reduced uncertainty. The battalion had turned an emotional problem into an information problem. And once it became information, they could control it. Pause the story for a moment and look at what is really happening here. This is not just about mail. It is about how an army keeps itself steady over time. Morale is not abstract. It depends on systems. When those systems fail, the effect spreads quietly. A soldier who has not heard from home in months does not fight the same way as one who has. That difference is hard to measure, but it is real. This is why logistics matters. Not only fuel, food, and ammunition, information also moves through systems, letters, reports, updates. When those slow down or stop, the entire structure begins to strain. The 68 was placed at a point where that strain was already visible. Their job was to restore flow. Not just movement of objects, but movement of connection. Look at the numbers carefully. Army sources indicate the battalion could handle more than 65,000 pieces of mail in a single shift. Other official summaries, such as from the Army Women's Museum, suggest that at peak they process more than 80,000 items in a day. These figures come from different summaries, and they should be understood as estimates rather than exact matches, but both point to the same reality. The scale was high, and the pace was sustained. Now consider what that means in practice. Each item had to be checked, sorted, and directed. Each one had to pass through a system that did not exist before they built it. This was not speed alone. It was controlled speed. There is another layer to this. Leadership under prejudice. The battalion operated inside a segregated army. That meant their work was watched closely, often judged differently. In that environment, discipline becomes even more important, not just to succeed, but to maintain credibility. They did not respond with shortcuts. They did not lower standards to move faster. They built a system that could hold under pressure. That is the difference between temporary success and lasting impact. A modern audience often focuses on what looks dramatic. Movement, sound, visible action. But many decisive moments in war do not look dramatic at all. They happen in places like this. Tables, records, quiet coordination. The real lesson here is simple. Good commanders identify the actual bottleneck. Not the most visible one, but the one that limits everything else. For the 68, that bottleneck was not the piles of mail. It was the lack of a working system. Once they fixed that, everything else followed. The work itself was demanding, but the environment around it added another layer that could not be ignored. The 68 served in a segregated army. Their mission was important, yet their position inside the system was not equal. Recognition was limited. Expectations were uneven. This shaped every decision they made. From the start, Adams understood that her battalion would not be judged only on results. They would be judged as representatives. Every delay, every mistake, every success would carry more weight than it should have. That created a difficult choice. They could keep their heads down, do only what was assigned, avoid attention, accept slower progress, and limit risk. They could push back openly against every slight, challenge the treatment they faced, but risk disrupting the work and slowing the mission. Or they could take a different path, hold discipline, protect their standards, let performance speak without losing control of the system they were building. The constraints were constant. Racism existed inside the army and beyond it. The pressure to prove themselves never eased. At the same time, the workload did not slow. The backlog still needed to be cleared. The system still needed to function every hour. Adams chose the third option. She set the tone early. Standards would not drop. Tempo would not break. The battalion would not react emotionally in ways that damaged their mission. Their answer would be consistency. That meant speed, but controlled speed. Order, not chaos. Every shift maintaining the same level of focus. Every section doing its part without hesitation. You can see it in how the work continued. Long hours did not change the structure. Pressure did not change the system. The index kept growing. The flow of mail kept moving. The pace held steady. This was not passive endurance. It was command presence. Adams maintained authority over the mission and over her unit. She protected their purpose from distraction. That required discipline at every level, not just from her, but from the entire battalion. There were moments where slowing down might have felt easier. Moments where frustration could have broken rhythm. But that did not happen. The system they built became their focus. It held them together. The result became clear over time. The backlog began to shrink faster than expected. The 6-month estimate no longer defined the mission. The work was moving ahead of that timeline. By maintaining structure and discipline, the battalion did more than meet expectations. They exceeded them. The Britain backlog was cleared in roughly half the expected time. That outcome did not come from a single decision. It came from consistency under pressure. Day after day, shift after shift. This is where the story moves beyond simple perseverance. Perseverance is continuing under difficulty. What happened here was more controlled than that. It was leadership that held shape under institutional pressure. It was a commander who understood that losing discipline would cost more than any external obstacle. Adams would later be recognized as a landmark figure in Army history. That recognition came years after the work itself. But the foundation of it was built here inside those warehouses where the conditions were uneven and the expectations were not balanced. The battalion's response did not rely on words. It relied on results. And those results changed how the mission was seen. By the time the backlog in Birmingham was cleared, the mission could have ended there. The hardest phase was over. The system worked. The results were visible. For many units, that would have been enough. But the situation did not stop in Britain. In May 1945, the battalion moved across the Channel to Rouen, France. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the postal problem had not disappeared. Another backlog was waiting. Some of the mail there had been delayed for years. Letters written long before had never reached their destination. The environment changed, but the core problem remained. At that point, Adams and her battalion faced another decision. They could treat Birmingham as the main success, slow the pace, except that they had already proven what they needed to prove. They could reduce the scope, focus only on part of the backlog since the war was ending and priorities were shifting. Or they could carry the same system forward, apply it again in a new place under different conditions. The constraints were real. One was not Birmingham. The layout was different. The backlog had its own patterns. The war's end was changing how units moved and how records were kept. Later in the year, the battalion itself would be reduced in size as operations scaled down. It would have been easy for the system to lose its shape under those changes. Instead, they chose to keep it intact. They reapplied the same structure, 3 shifts, continuous work, the same disciplined flow, the same reliance on their index system, the same focus on accuracy and movement at the same time. This was not automatic. It required adjustment. Each new space had to be organized. Each backlog had its own complications. But the foundation did not change. That decision proved something important. Their success in Birmingham was not tied to one location. It was tied to how they worked. As the system took hold in Rouen, the results followed again. The backlog began to move. Letters that had been sitting for long periods found direction. The process repeated, not because the conditions were the same, but because the method was strong enough to adapt. Later, the battalion moved again, this time to Paris. The mission continued there, even as the larger war ended and the structure of operations began to shift. By this point, their achievement was no longer limited to a single warehouse. It had become a model. They had shown that a well-built system could survive movement, fatigue, and change in environment. It could carry across distance. It could hold under new pressure. That is the lesson here. A solution that only works in one place is limited. A solution that moves with the unit becomes part of its strength. The 68 did not just clear a backlog. They proved that their way of working could function anywhere it was needed. This was not a combat assault. There were no firefights in these rooms. But the strain was real, and it stayed with them. The work did not stop. 3 shifts every day, cold air moving through buildings that never fully warmed. Hands sorting, lifting, Checking, repeating. Precision mattered. A small mistake could send a letter in the wrong direction. Again, the weight was not only physical. It was emotional. Each envelope carried a voice from home. A mother writing, a wife waiting, a child asking when someone would return. Some letters were already months old. Some reached the warehouse after the person they were meant for had moved or been injured, or worse. The battalion could not control that, but they still had to handle each one with care. Imagine reading names again and again, realizing that behind each one is a life paused by war. The work required focus, but it also required distance. Too much emotion could slow the system. Too little could take away its meaning. They found a balance. They worked with discipline, but they understood what they were holding. This was not just paper. It was connection. It was proof that someone somewhere was still waiting. That is what they restored. When the mail began to move again, something else moved with it. Soldiers received news. Families received replies. A rhythm returned that had been missing. That change did not make headlines, but it mattered. There is also another part of the story that cannot be ignored. When the war ended, many of these women returned home without the recognition their work deserved. Their service was real, but the response they received reflected a larger reality. Indifference, sometimes hostility, especially for Black veterans whose contributions were often overlooked. That does not change what they did. The 68 carried more than mail. They carried voices across distance and uncertainty. They held a line that most people never saw. And because of that, millions stayed connected when it mattered most. After Rouen, the work did not end. The battalion continued into Paris, carrying the same system forward. Even as the war in Europe came to a close, the need for order remained. Mail still had to move. Records still had to be matched. The flow they had built did not stop with the end of combat. Over time, the unit began to change. As the war ended, the battalion was reduced in size. Some members rotated out, others prepared to return home. The pace slowed, but the impact of their work remained in place. They had cleared backlogs that once seemed fixed. They had restored a system that had nearly stalled across an entire theater, and they had done it under conditions that tested both discipline and endurance. When they returned home, they did not receive the level of recognition their work had earned. They were awarded campaign and victory medals, as many service members were. But public acknowledgement of what they had achieved came much later. Decades passed before their story began to reach a wider audience. In 2022, the 6th Central Postal Directory Battalion was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. That recognition placed their service in its proper context. It acknowledged the scale of what they had done and the conditions under which they had done it. Charity Adams's legacy followed a similar path. Her leadership is now formally recognized by the Army. The Memorial of Fort Gregg Adams reflects that change. It connects her name to a place that will remain part of the Army's structure moving forward. What changed after this story is not only about recognition. It is about understanding. The 68 showed that military effectiveness is not limited to combat power. It also depends on systems that support people, communication, records, morale. When those are strong, units hold together. When they fail, everything else becomes harder. Their work made that clear. Today, their story stands as part of how we understand women's service in World War II. Not as an addition to the narrative, but as a central piece of it. What this story shows is simple, but often overlooked. Leadership is not only tested where bullets land. It is tested where systems break down, where records stop making sense, where morale begins to fade without anyone noticing it first. The 68 stepped into that kind of problem. They did not look for recognition. They did not choose a mission that would draw attention. They were given a task that seemed ordinary, then proved it was not. Charity Adams led with clarity and control. She did not allow the scale of the problem to define the outcome. She built structure where there was none. She held discipline where pressure could have broken it. And the women she led matched that standard shift after shift. Their work did not change the war in a single moment. It changed how people endured it. It restored connection. It gave soldiers something steady in an environment that rarely was that matters. So when we think about courage in military history, it is worth asking a different question. Do we give enough attention to the units that kept people connected, informed, and steady even when their work looked ordinary from the outside? Led by Major Charity Adams, the 68 cleared massive wartime mail backlogs in Britain and France, restoring morale for millions in the European theater.